All right, everybody, let's briefly talk about one area of systemic racism that may seem pretty straightforward, but we find again and again is a way that systemic racism finds its way into our lives. You've probably heard the phrase, those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it. It's a good phrase, makes a lot of sense. And I think in many ways it's true. But there's another part of that that we don't often talk about, and that is that the history we learn must actually be true and correct. Right? We don't want to repeat the failures of the past. That's true. But if what we are taught is not reality, it's not the truth, then we are doomed to repeat it. And that's especially true when it comes to the history of race relations in the United States. There's been a lot in the news or online lately about the Tulsa race riots, also known as the destruction of Black Wall Street. Now, immediately you might be thinking, I don't know about that. Or you might be thinking, I've only heard of that recently. And if either of those is the case, then you see how systemic racism works in our history. The Tulsa race riots were an attack by white people on one of the most well-to-do and growing black areas of the country. It resulted in the decimation of blocks upon blocks of the black neighborhood, including being firebombed from airplanes from above. More than 300 African Americans were killed, yet it's not in most of our history books. Most white people I know had never heard of it. I didn't know about it till grad school when I happened to be doing a research project on race relations in Churches of Christ. Let's talk about a couple more. Do you know about the Red Summer of 1919? Where riots occurred in more than 30 cities across the United States. Again, riots, the race riots, these weren't people rioting because of racism. These were people being attacked and killed because they were black. And what was that disguised as? A fear of communism. These were a bunch of socialists who were going to take over the country, and they were going to use black people to do it. Sound familiar? Have you heard about the Tuskegee syphilis study? Where the public health sector of our government decided to study syphilis in African American men. They found a bunch of poor, mostly sharecroppers. They brought them in. They tested them, discovered that many of them had syphilis, and then studied them without ever letting them know they had syphilis. By telling them they were receiving free health care, better than other people around them. And even about 15 years into the study, I believe the study started around 1932, about 15 years into the study, when we now knew definitively that penicillin is what should be used for treating people with syphilis, the study continued. We just didn't treat these people. We didn't tell them. Many of them gave it to their wives. Many of them had children born with syphilis. We never told them. They were discouraged from going to doctors. The doctors in the area were discouraged from giving them the cure. This lasted for more than 40 years. We see this sometimes in our textbooks. Just a few years ago, there was a textbook put out that talked about Africans coming to the United States, and it referred to them as immigrants. Yeah, they were immigrating. bound in chains, immigrating, sold to work on plantations, but they were immigrating. And one of the most prominent, of course, is the way we view the secession of southern states and the Civil War. I was taught growing up that the Civil War was caused by sectionalism and states' rights, and that slavery, or the abolition of slavery, only became an issue when it was kind of figured out that the North was going to lose or not, it was going to go well, and so Lincoln uses slavery to continue the war effort. I want to read to you from the Texas Declaration of Secession. So Texas, the state where I grew up, the state where I learned history, the Texas Declaration of Secession from the United States of America. This was February 2nd, 1861. In all the non-slave holding states, so in other words, the northern states, in violation of that good faith and comity which should exist between entirely distinct nations, the people have formed themselves into a great sectional party, now strong enough in numbers to control the affairs of each of those states, based upon an unnatural feeling of hostility to these southern states and their beneficent and patriarchal system of African slavery, proclaiming the debasing doctrine of equality of all men, irrespective of race and color, a doctrine at war with nature, in opposition to the experience of mankind, and in violation of the plainest revelations of divine law. They demand the abolition of Negro slavery throughout the Confederacy. If you read the secession documents of all the states that seceded from the Union, their primary reason given by them is the continuation of slavery. We have to leave because these other states are going to abolish slavery, and it's our divine right to have it. It's our right as a state to have it. It's our right as a people to have it. It's obvious that it's true and divine and righteous. The reason for the secession of the southern states and them starting a war was to continue slavery. Now, I could go into lots of other examples, but the point is not to name every single thing about history that we have not been taught correctly, or that hasn't been shown in the proper light, or maybe it's just been hidden so we didn't know about it. The point is this: much of our history is simply written from the perspective and the point of view of white, primarily men. Right? There's the Great Expansion West. We don't call that the Great Thieving of Land. There's the Indian Wars. We don't call it genocide of native peoples. When we give the history of our country, we don't start from the perspective of those who were crushed and defeated by the expansion of our economic impetus. That's not what we do. And so we do not learn the full story, and we do not learn the truth. You know, there's much being talked about right now about statues. It's primarily Civil War statues. No matter your feelings, here's a couple things you should know. Number one, the vast majority of those statues, not built immediately after the Civil War. No, built years and years later during the era of Jim Crow. Or the second big time of building, right in the middle of the Civil Rights era. I wonder why those were built then. Here's the second thing you should know. When you put up a statue, you are proclaiming something great and grand and heroic about that person or that event or those people, right? Like, we don't put up a statue of a murderer to remember the victims of that murderer, right? We would never put up a statue of Charles Manson, right? We want to remember what happened and remember those victims, but we'd never put up a statue of Charles Manson. We put up statues because we want to honor and proclaim the goodness or rightness of a cause. There are no statues in Germany of Hitler, even though his war campaign was much more successful than the Confederacy. No, the statues that we have put up are to honor. But what are they honoring? What history are they teaching? People say, and I hear it often, that if you tear down those statues, you're erasing history. I don't agree with that. History can be found in books and online and in the words of people. There's lots of ways to learn history in museums. So I don't think you're erasing history by taking down those statues. But by having those statues, you are bending history. Because what you are saying is, these are the heroes. Whenever someone who was part of a horrific cause has a statue honoring them as a hero, it changes our perspective. Maybe that cause wasn't so bad. Maybe what they were fighting for was pretty good. Putting up horrible people as heroes erases history. It erases history. The taking down of those statues wouldn't erase history, but the putting up of them was an attempt to do so. To change the narrative and to put black people in their place. Those who fail to learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat it. Let's learn history and let's learn the truth.